Hello, everyone. This is Adam Ross with Florida Tennis on the Bleacher Brothers Sports Network. We are absolutely privileged to have with us Steve Flink, tennis journalist, historian, Hall of Famer. Steve, thank you so very much for taking your time tonight to join us. And how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Adam. It's a pleasure to be with you. Obviously, I've seen you at a lot of different places in the U.S. Open, and we've spoken on the phone a lot through the years. So it's a pleasure to be with you tonight.
Well, it is an absolute honor to have you here. And I know you're a humble man, but I have to do an intro, so just bear with me, okay?
Sure.
You are obviously a renowned tennis journalist. You a history with World Tennis Magazine with Gladys Heldman, another Hall of Famer, Tennis Week, broadcaster including Tennis Channel, tennis historian, tennis statistician, author of books including what I consider to be the definitive tome on Pete Sampras, Greatness Revisited, incredible, the greatest tennis matches of the 20th century, the greatest tennis matches of all time. I want to show. I love this book, and thank you for doing this, Steve. I really don't know how you do these books. It's to encapsulate all this information, but we'll get to that. It's a great book. Um, you're inducted into the International Tennis Hall of Fame in 2017 as a contributor. You're a consultant for the International Tennis Hall of Fame and a member of the nominating committee. I could go on all night, Steve, but in terms of doing an introduction, but I thought who better to do an introduction than for me to take the words of a Hall of Famer, Chris Evert. Okay. So for all our viewers, listeners out there, this is what Chris Evert had to say about Steve Flink in the forward to she did the forward to this book. She did the forward to the greatest tennis matches of all time and the Pete Sampras book. But this is what Chris Evert had to say about Steve Flink. Steve Flink is the right person to take on the task of selecting the best matches of all time. He knows the game of tennis as well as anybody. He is a good journalist, but he also has a tennis player's mind. Steve knew my results and matches better than I did. All through my career in the 1970s and 1980s, it has caused much laughter between us when I would be asked a question about my record at a press conference. I would always look over to Steve and he would have the answers. In many cases, I would inaccurately recall an important detail about a match, and Steve would interrupt me to set the record straight. I've always admired Steve's style of writing for its fairness and accuracy. We have seen the big matches in our lives the same way. He has never written an article about the US Open or any major tournament that failed to capture the essence of a match. We have always been on the same page about tennis. His fairness is a real strength in his reporting. It seems to me that many writers do not describe what really happens on the court. Steve characteristically gets deep inside the matches and reports them as well as anyone in the field. I think the readers of the book will agree with me. Chris Evert, Boca Raton, Florida, February 2012. Well, Steve, let's start there. What are your thoughts on those accolades from the incredible, incomparable, amazing Chris Evert?
Obviously, very flattering to have her put me in that context and that kind of perspective. And I can assure you that my respect for her is measures right up to what she said about me. I mean, it's mutual. And it's one of those things. It's fascinating looking back because the game was so different when she broke in and when I broke in, which was essentially simultaneously. And we're talking about the early 70s. And I met Chris in 1973 when I interviewed her. It was the first published piece I ever had with World Tennis Magazine, and I went to work for the magazine full time starting the next year. But in 73 at the French Open, I just walked up to her. I had met her mother, but I had never met her. And I just walked up to her after the quarterfinals, and she told me to come back again after the semis, just find her coming off the court. It was that simple in those days.
Wow.
She was actually not playing in Chatrier. She was playing on one of the outside courts, and she beat Frankie Durr. She destroyed her in the semis, and then we went into the player lounge and spoke for about a half an hour, and I did the interview prior to her first major final against Margaret Court. So over a period, from that point, we developed a nice immediate rapport, and by 75, we'd become really quite good friends. And so that was always there. There was always this special connection we had. as player and reporter. And part of it was the times that we grew up in, the times when both of us emerged. But she knew how much respect I had for her, and I feel humbled that she had that much respect for me, and we're friends to this day.
Well, that leads me into two questions. My interactions with Chris Evert are much different than yours, obviously. Um, she is, I'm just gonna say I love Chris Evert. She's one of the greatest players in Fort Lauderdale, but she's an intimidating presence. She is greatness personified. And I'm wondering when you were in her presence in 1973, if you could feel the power, or is that just was it too early on to really get the sense of greatness that was within her?
No, I sensed it. I believed it. I had
Mhm.
seen her. I first started watching her in at the 1971 U.S. Open, which was, of course, a landmark breakthrough tournament for her in the sense of being 16 and getting to the semifinals, and three great comebacks in a row, three great matches in a row, sort of highlighted by a match against Marianne Eisel where she saved 6 match points, and that she propelled her. She went all the way to the semis and lost to Billie Jean King. So watching her in that tournament, I was absolutely convinced that she was a superstar in the making, that this was not just a startling run from a teenager who had a hot 2 weeks, but things were going to, she would come down to earth. I never believed that. I believe that that was the beginning of something substantial. So yes, I sensed that. I sensed it very much. And I also was very impressed that day when we did the interview, just with how much poise she had and professionalism for somebody who was, I mean, this is 1973. She's still 18 at this point. She turned 19 at the end of that year. And I was amazed how it wasn't that she was relatively soft spoken in those days. She became more and more confident in her ability to communicate, but she still was very precise with what she had to say, and very honest, and in the way she assessed other players and herself. And it was nice that it would happen there, which of course turned out to be her best of all majors. You look at the 18 majors, and she won 6 US, but she won 7 French. And she didn't win it that year. She lost the final the next day to Margaret Court. But I sensed that I had no doubt in my mind when I spoke to her that day where she was headed. None whatsoever.
So my second question about that is, as a Hall of Fame journalist, and this is a tricky question, I guess, when you cross the line and become friends with an athlete, um, how does that impact your ability to report on an athlete? How did you walk that fine tightrope with, let's say, Chris Everett?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Mhm.
It really only, it was sort of a singular case for me. I mean, I got to know other players quite well in the years to come. I got to know Pete Sampras quite well, but the relationship with her was, as I say, singular, isolated, special. I had to be very conscious of it. So what I did was, when I joined the staff of World Tennis the next year, and as the friendship grew over the years, for the most part, I just would not write art. I wouldn't write about her except rarely. I wouldn't cover, for the most part, I didn't cover the women's tournaments. I covered mainly the men, and so I just tried to stay out of the way, stay out of the way of conflict, because as a professional, I had to do that, and she understood that. That didn't mean we weren't having private conversations, and that was perfectly fine, and that there's nothing wrong with that. But I had to, as a professional writer, make sure that other players were aware. And this also came into play when I started doing commentary, because in addition, you mentioned being a statistician, I also did commentary for many years for MSG Network, where the women's Virginia Slims championships would be played, and Chris
Sure.
would be playing, and I'd be commenting on the air, and some for ESPN. So it is a fine line, but I just did my best to. And listen, she joked herself. When she introduced me at Newport, when she was my presenter, when I went in 2017,
Sure.
she joked about how she thought I did a good job when I was on the air, except when I criticized her second serve.
Oh, that's great.
And everybody laughed at that, but it was true. I on some of the telecasts, if I had to be honest, and that was another way that I confronted possible conflict was just to prove to viewers or even the insiders and the players themselves that I could constructively criticize her game, and I think it was important that I did. So it's a
Sure.
great question, and I hope I navigated it well. I believe I did, uh, because it was a unique set of circumstances. You know, the fact that we were coming along at the same time, and I mean, listen, as you know, it would be inconceivable in this era that somebody, let's say even the Serena Williams era, that somebody would have just, young reporter, Serena, let me introduce myself. It's not how it works. There are agents,
Sure.
there are barriers. It was a different world back then. And I'm very grateful, by the way, that I came along when I did. Beyond the relationship with Chris that you're asking me about, I just mean emerging as a reporter when I did, coming along, growing up with the game in the 60s, starting to go to Wimbledon at 65 when I was still 12, and then breaking in full time as a tennis reporter in 74. That was a golden age for the sport in terms of popularity and the tennis boom. And the tennis world itself was a bit more intimate. And I knew just about everybody in the press rooms when I'd go to the Wimbledon and the US Open in the 70s into the 80s. You knew everybody very, very well, and from all the countries, and the players, it was just easier to get to know the players or to walk up to the players. I did that with Borg as well, by the way, at Hilton Head. When I interviewed him for the first time in 76, I just walked up to him and set up the interview. And by the way, I set up the interview with Borg. It's the first year he's won Wimbledon, Adam.
Okay.
And I said, should we meet here on the press balconies during the old World Invitational Tournament, 4-man, 4-woman event? They played in the fall, tape it for TV on ABC. And Borg said, why don't you meet me back here at 2:30? I go into the stands and start watching Arthur Ashe. And there was always partially a fan in me with all of this. I loved watching the sport so much that I could get so immersed. So I'm watching the Ashe match, completely losing track of the time. Supposed to have been there at 2:30. I look at my watch, it's 2:50. And I said, oh my God. And I looked over
Wow.
over to the press balcony, and there was Bjorn Borg just sitting there patiently in his typically dignified way, unruffled way. And I raced out of the stands and went up to got over to the balcony as quickly as I could, wasn't far away from that center court. And I said, Bjorn, I'm really sorry. And he said, oh, no, no problem. No problem. I mean, again, imagine this day and age, if you kept a superstar waiting for 20 minutes, they might have been gone after 5 minutes, 2 minutes. So I'm just saying it was a different world, and timing is everything in life, Adam. And I look back on my career and being fortunate enough to go in the Hall of Fame and all the other joy that I've had from the sport. And I say to myself, could I possibly have come along at a better time? And I don't think I could have.
Wow. It's fascinating. You know, as much as I want to get into your background, Steve, and we will, I have to kind of pick up on a few things. So, um, my mentor is someone that I lost, Jim Martz, who
Yeah.
put his heart and soul into Florida tennis for over 30 years and helped me understand how to navigate. He was very, very close with Chris Everett as well. Your thoughts on Jim and his contribution to the game we love?
Jim, I got to know Jim well in the 70s, when he was at the Miami Herald. And I also was friendly, quite friendly in those days with one of his colleagues, Jim Sarney, who worked for the Fort
Sure.
Lauderdale. And Jim, what I liked about him was he had that even disposition, which I'm sure you observed and felt all the years you knew him. And I'm sure whatever advice he gave you, if he was critical, it was done in a very kind of compassionate, decent way, because that was him. I thought he was sort of the quintessential reporter. Jim was very measured and low key and easygoing. And sure, he knew Chris well, as I did, and other players, but he reported with great professionalism and insight. But above all else, I think what people felt about Jim was that he was just a fundamentally decent human being. I can't recall him having a bad day. We had many conversations, and I can recall days when maybe his spirits were not up to the level they had been the day before, but he wasn't one of those people who took it out on you or drowned you in his problems. He was not caught up in himself. So if anything, my only criticism of him was sometimes not realizing just how good he was. Not I mean, that was a nice quality to have. I don't think it held him back, but I think Jim was highly respected throughout the industry, and I was flattered also in 1979. He for his column in the Miami Herald, it must have been about a 400-word column. He didn't have a lot of space, but they'd let him do the column, and he asked if he could write one on me, and I was pleased that he did, and I have it to this day. So I share your
Wow.
um, appreciation of Jim Martz, and I thought his passing was a sad, very sad event. And in fact, you, of course, were the one that I had heard about it, but you and I spoke around that time. I
Yeah.
know how much it hurt you personally because of how well you knew him. And I just was stunned and distressed like everybody else because Jim took good care of himself. I thought he'd live to 103. So very, in a nutshell, Jim Martz was a very good man.
Yeah, I've gotten to know his sister, um, a wonderful woman, and nephews, nieces, and suffice to say that yeah, I just miss him, and I think the tennis world misses him as well. And I don't want this to become a downer of a show, but I have to mention, I'm so sorry, the loss of Fred Stolle. You know, fiery Fred
Of course.
Stolle, someone that I got to spend time with later in his life. You know, not just a great tennis player, but just a wonderful human being. And I'll just give you one quick Fred Stolle story. And this is the last dinner, not the last time we spoke, but the last dinner we had together, which was in Aventura, Florida, before he moved to Palm Springs. And they say that people remember their losses, great ones, more than their wins, and they hate losing, you know, more than they love winning. And Fred was, you know, very obviously very proud of his career, loved all his fellow Australians, but of all things, he at that dinner he lamented that he had never won Wimbledon, and I drove away from that dinner thinking a great man who has accomplished so much inside and outside the tennis court. But what a you know, again, what a fiery thing to say at that age with all of the mileage behind you. To just look up at one point, just kind of out of nowhere and say, you know, I just regret not winning Wimbledon. Well, your thought on Fred and those kind of
Well,
thoughts.
yeah, let me just comment on your last point first. I really can understand understand why he said it because 63 he lost the final to Chuck McKinley, and then he lost the next 2 years in the finals to Roy Emerson. So a bit unfortunate. Emerson had his number. It was his doubles partner, and he was
Right.
a better player than Fred, and Fred would be the first to admit it. So McKinley was just on a tear at the 63 Wimbledon, just was unstoppable. And because that one, retrospectively, I would have thought Fred would have beaten McKinley. So I can understand it because to be 3 years in a row in the final and be as good on grass as he was. And of course, in 66, he won Forest Hills. He won the U.S. Nationals. So he was tremendous on grass, and these were his prime years. So I can see why he just felt like, oh, maybe if I didn't have to play MO 2 years in a row, if only I could have played a bit better against McKinley. He knew he would. You don't get to the finals 3 years in a row and then win two majors in the same period, one at Roland Garros and one at Forest Hills, without being worthy of those honors. So I can understand it. Plus the reverence that he had for Wimbledon.
Yes,
Like
yes.
like a lot of the players, many of these players, including many Americans, by the way, will tell you that as hard, as much as we all love the U.S. Open, that Wimbledon is still and always has been and always will be the preeminent event in tennis. So that's why I think Fred would make that comment to you. I can well understand it. But listen, I shared, again, once more, a similar appreciation of him. And we worked for many years together. I got to know him actually in 67 when I was a camper at the Chase. He came to play an exhibition. I was 15 at the time. And then it wasn't that long that after, it was about another 10 years that I really uh, coordinated with him, was around him as a reporter. So Fred, and then starting in the 80s, we worked together for about 10 years on instruction pieces for World Tennis Magazine. So, and the years that followed, I would see him at the majors. We served on different committees together. and he was a really terrific guy. As you know, the Australians are all known for their hearts and souls and the kind of human beings they are, the personalities they've become. And Fred stood out, I think, among the caps. This is no knock on Roy Emerson or Ken Rosewell or Rod Laver or Lou Holt or any of them. But I think if you had asked all of those guys, who is the most likable among us? Which one would we most want to have dinner with if we could only pick one? I think across the board they would have said Fred Stolle.
Yeah, I agree, and I think they would probably most likely have a beer with knowing those guys would be Fred. And by the way, when he said that he had a love for Emo, it was just a wistful kind of a momentary passing. And I thought to myself, the level of competition and the thought process of they think on a different level. But I love Fred Stolle. I miss Fred Stolle, and I know you do as well. And unfortunately, as we get older, I mean, you're getting younger, Steve, but the rest of us, as we get a little bit older, we're losing some of our great, great players, great personalities. And it was a different time because again, you had the pre-open era and you had the barnstorming. It was a different generation and a different kind of attitude. And you know what I'm saying? It was a different group,
Oh,
a different
sure.
mindset. And I do love the pre-open era. I'm sure you do as well.
I do, but the great part about Fred was that he crossed over from those amateur years and got to play. He didn't have that many prime years left once Open tennis started in
Sure.
'68, but he got to experience it and he became a part of it. And yeah, that was a terrific time in the sport. Again,
Sure.
that was how I had broken into starting watching amateur tennis and isolated pro tournaments, and then watching the Open era explode.
Yeah, and one of the things, Fred, I had to ask him about was coaching one of my all-time favorite players, Vitas Gerulaitis, and his face lit up, and he was telling me about Vitas's, yellow Rolls Royce, and maybe Vitas occasionally went to Studio 54. I don't know all the details, but he loved Vitas, and he loved coaching him. He really did.
And he did a great job with it. He
Right.
really did. And they had good, really nice rapport. And I remember many times the way Vitas lauded Fred, and they laughed a lot, but he took Fred's advice very seriously. And Vitas, obviously, he got one major, he got one Australian, and we saw him, of course, in the finals of the U.S. Open against John McEnroe in '79, the Wimbledon semis, and he had a really consistent record, finals of the French. And Fred had a lot to do with that. He really
Right.
would fine tuned Vitas's game.
I was going to ask you this later, but I'll touch on it now. Vitas having won the December 1977 Australian Open doubles title, at the 75 Wimbledon Championships, two Italian Opens in 77 and 79, the 1978 WCT Finals. Fred told me he thought Vitas should be in the Tennis Hall of Fame. Now, I don't want to put you on the spot because I know you're on the nominating committee, but can you even comment on your thoughts on whether Vitas has a shot to get into the International Tennis Hall of Fame? If you can't, that's fine.
No,
But
it's not that I can't. It's that I have mixed feelings about it. I feel like he was so close to having the merits, and I try to sort of separate how I felt about him personally. And I didn't know him that well, but I did know him, and I, like everybody else, he was. I enjoyed being around him immensely and loved his sense of humor and felt he was a
sure,
great player. Whether was he great enough, I think, had Vitas lived and gone on to do some things off the court and continue to run these clinics and taken on some other dimensions, other positions post playing, that he would have been a prime candidate, because you would have taken his career achievements as a player and added on whatever else he did post career. And sadly, he never had that opportunity. So I'm very conflicted about whether
right,
he belongs in there or not based on his record. The record is borderline. And that's no
right,
knock on him. As I say, he was a great player.
sure. Well,
But
I have to vote. I don't get a vote, Steve, but I would vote for him. I attended one of his clinics in Central Park. It was him with Johnny Mack and Bjorn Borg, and I just have such huge respect. He had a heart of gold. Love the kids. I'll never forget that day. So if I ever get a vote, I'm voting him in. All right.
oh, I understand. And look, it's very, there are a lot of people in the game who would share
Hmm.
that view. I'm just giving you my honest view.
Sure.
and I don't enjoy saying that because again, that he's someone you would love to see honored in such a fashion. And who knows, it may still happen one day, but the record to me is borderline. I don't think it would have been had he gone on to do some other things in the game. I think then he could have come in very likely as a contributor. It
Sure.
would have been a situation kind of like a Cliff Drysdale or many of the other great contributors who've gone
Right.
in, who had distinguished playing careers, but then did many things. In Cliff's case, of course, it was his broadcasting. So, and
Sure. Sure.
that's what I mean. That's another avenue. He was establishing himself as one of the best
Yes.
commentators around. He was terrific in the booth. He might have gone on to do that for decades.
Yeah, I've heard Johnny Mac talk about him with reverence, and he was tight with Borg, and I know he was beginning his career as a broadcaster, and unfortunately, we lost him too young in a very strange accident, which we won't get into today. But let's get into some happy stuff, okay? And Steve, we're still not into your background yet, but we will get in a moment. But I do need to mention Maddie Keys winning the Australian Open. Um, Spoke to James Blake just the other day about it. And it seems that there is this just wonderful feeling about it. I should mention um, that she is our cover story in the latest issue, which I will get out to you shortly, Steve. But your thoughts on Madison Keys, what it means to kind of battle through a career and have that moment in the sun. Your thoughts on Maddie Keys?
Uh, it, I think my thoughts probably are almost identical to what most of the tennis world felt, which was such heartfelt support that she got, an appreciation and praise, because when you've dedicated yourself to your craft and you look like one of these players who's just gonna, when her career is over, is going to be seen as a slight underachiever, a terrific player who made the finals of the US Open in 2017 and lost to Sloane Stephens and other major semis, and very good record, but that was not quite cut out for greatness that way. Combination of reasons being, her own inner belief, the lack of inner belief maybe that she had for many years, injuries, which people don't appreciate because people just don't understand, Adam. That 2017 final, I mean, Sloane might have beaten her anyway. Their matches tended to be very close, and Sloane was very capable of beating Maddie, but Keys was injured that day. She was in bad shape. She had hurt herself in the semis, and she did not give a typical account of herself. That was unfortunate. But be that as it may, I had thought we were going to have that. That was sort of where she was destined to end up in the annals of tennis, was as one of the leading Americans, as a great professional, somebody, capable of first-rate tennis, but not winning a major. So to see her do it in that fashion, beating the likes of Svitolina and above all else, to beat Swiatek and Sabalenka back to back, saving a match point against Swiatek, beating Sabalenka in a three-setter as well. I mean, that's doing it in style. And it just seemed like she finally took the shackles off. She took it was as if she had burdened herself, and it was not an easy position to be in, where she knew everybody else. She was well aware of the skeptics, and they weren't skeptics of her personally. They were skeptics of her as a player, and she knew it, and she almost shared it. But then to do it in the clutch the way she did at the end was spectacular. So I just feel like we may not see anything more joyful in tennis over the course of this year. And I think, despite the fact that she, as we speak, she just lost a 11-1 to Sabalenka in the semis of Indian Wells, which was a tough loss to take and cold, windy conditions. But I'm not worried about her the rest of this year. I think she will perform well in the ensuing majors and have a pretty decent chance, a chance at Wimbledon, and maybe quite a good chance at the US Open, because, as I say, she's unburdened now. Now there's no, okay, sure, you'd love to add a second major, which would then give her a decent chance to that would enhance her chances to make it into the Hall of Fame someday. But the bottom line is, she knows she has that one. If she broke both legs tomorrow and could never play tennis again, or she had a Maureen Connolly horse riding accident, whatever it might be, she can be so gratified and proud that she pulled off that Australian Open crown, especially after it had reached the point where it just did not seem possible. So I think that will be maybe the story of the year. We'll see what happens in the next three majors, but there might not be anything that tops that in the women's game this year.
Right. And Steve, I have been remiss in not having you discuss a bit of your background, how you got to be where you are. So let's take our viewers, our listeners through just a little bit of how you become Hall of Famer Steve Flink. And I know you've given a lot of credit to your father, I think Stanley Flink, and he's been an inspiration. You've dedicated your books to him, but can you tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, well, you touched on something important. My father was a journalist who wrote on all topics, and he did a lot of other things outside of journalism as well. But he loved tennis. So as a kid, I would watch him play when I was very young, and that inspired me to play. And then the big pivotal point was when he took me out to Wimbledon in '65. And that, by the way, that was the year Fred lost his third final in a row. And we went out several days, but that first day just was so impactful, and to because I had watched some tennis prior to that, but now I was, for the first time, I'd gone to a tournament, and it's Wimbledon, and it just transformed my life. Because from that day forward, I followed it in the newspapers fervently every day. With the first thing I'd do is go to the agate type and look to see the results of the previous day's tournaments wherever the players were. And I got to Forest Hills later in the year because I had one parent living, my father was living in London at that time, my mother back in New York. So it just completely irrevocably changed my life. And I started reading World Tennis and subscribing to World Tennis the next year, and everything was just turned upside down. I mean, I never expected it, but it was my father getting me out there and encouraging me. And I think he thought it would just be a nice experience. He had
Right.
no idea that I would become so devoted to the sport.
Well, I remember you discussing you wrote a very important letter in your formative years. Um, and can you talk just a little bit about that? That was a very interesting story.
Yeah, well, Lance Tingay at the time, Adam, was that there were a lot of the World Tennis would do world rankings, top 10 men and women at the end of the year. A few other outlets would do it, but Lance Tingay's rankings in the London Daily Telegraph were sort of regarded as the gold standard. So I was aware of those, and I remember listening to WINS radio, and they announced his rankings in '66, and I wrote them down, and then I found a newspaper where they were printed as well, and I took it upon myself with a friend of mine that I went to school with, a fellow named Jimmy Green. We wrote a joint letter together, and the next couple of years I wrote the letters on my own, but basically saying, questioning some of his choices. Why did you have Billie Jean above Maria Bueno? Why wasn't Nancy Ritchie ahead of it? And it was very passionate, and he was very kind to answer. And he came back at me and said something along the lines of, "Now that you've taken my list apart, I will do the same for you." And it was that typically British understated way. And fortunately, Adam, so fortunately, you know how it is. You've done it yourself. You're quite a collector. So I know that you're very good at holding on to things. But as kids, we weren't necessarily, any of us were not necessarily that good. I regret many things that I didn't hold on to from my days growing up. Been pretty good about it since my 20s. But fortunately, the letter to Lance, I had it. And when I was trying to get together items for the Hall of Fame, when I was going in, my wife said to me, "You've got to send them that. You've got to give them that Lance Tingay letter." And I did, and they used it in the exhibit, and then they asked to keep it permanently. And I was very pleased that they did. They have it in a media cabinet that toward the back, and so it will always be there. And they explain the context. But that was, and the amazing thing is, this is '66. By '70, I knew him. I was still only 18 then, but I
Wow.
met. And then by '74, when I was full time working for World Tennis, we were colleagues, and I would join him in the press rooms. And so that was quite an evolution for me, but it was very inspiring to get the letter back from Lance, and I remember then the years that followed, the next couple of years, when I would do the same thing and go back and forth and question some of his choices, knowing that he'd come back at me. I would go to, I'd be checking my mail. I couldn't wait to get home to see if the mail had come and see if he'd written me again. So that was a
Sure.
nice chapter in my life.
There's another story you've told me that stuck with me involving you, one of your mentors, Bud Collins, West Side Tennis Club, Arthur Ashe. I think you know where I'm going with this. Do you remember the story I'm talking about? It involved you not getting to Bud Collins in a timely
Oh yes,
fashion.
yes, yes.
Yes. Okay.
Of course. Okay. Well, you're talking about Bud was also instrumental when you talk about my career in the early stages, and I mentioned my father, how important he was, the inspiration of Lance. Bud was probably the most critical because I met him in '69 when I was 17. Again, my father had met him a few years earlier, and he took me to the press room. We walked across the grounds and tracked Bud down in the press room. And the guard came, went in and got Bud, and Bud came out, and that was how we met. And he was very congenial, very nice, and he knew I wanted to become a tennis reporter, and my father was explaining that. So in any case, 3 years later, I started to work with Bud behind the scenes when he would do his telecast for at the U.S. Open for CBS and also Boston Globe columns. So Arthur Ashe is playing Ilie Nastase in the '72 U.S. Open final, and the match ended. And I'm still only 20, and I was an ardent admirer of Arthur's, and I felt distraught because he had Nastase beat. It looked like he had the match won, 2-1, 4-2 in the fourth set, and he lost it in five. And I watched Arthur, and Arthur was fighting back the tears himself. It was unusual for him, but he was sitting by it in his courtside bench and hands over his eyes, and you could see that he was fighting the tears. And then I watched him take this walk back to the clubhouse, the long walk, and avoid the crowds along the railing and walk through the field courts and go back. So I walked back there myself, and I kind of lost track of the fact that I needed to be helping Bud, that he was expecting me to come into the press room right down beneath where the booth was and start helping him as he put his column together. So I disappeared for a while, and I got back to the clubhouse and started bawling my eyes out. And I was really, that was another reason I wasn't in condition to go back there for about another 20 minutes after crying. So I come back, and Bud says, "Well, where were you?" And I was very honest with him. I told him exactly what happened, and he said, I'm not gonna say a word. I completely understand, And then we just moved on from there, and I helped him, and that was that. But that was one of the more poignant moments. I later wrote about that for World Tennis in '84 when I thought back on my U.S. Open experiences, because as a kid, I had idolized Arthur, and now I was still only 20 and sort of in that transition phase between fan and reporter, getting on my way to being a reporter and grooming myself, but the fan was still in me. So that I just hated seeing him lose that match because it would have been his second U.S. Open. And then, interestingly enough, I interviewed Arthur about 4 months later. I didn't tell him. I didn't tell him at the time about my crying experience.
Sure.
It was in London, and he was playing a tournament indoors at the Albert Hall, and I set up the interview, and which was not published. It was just bad luck. World Tennis didn't use it the way they did the Chrissy interview the next year, but it was a pleasure to sit down and talk to him. And I brought up that match with Nastase, and I said, "Do you ever think about that match? And does that ever? Do you still think about it?" He said, "I think about it all the time." He said, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it." And I thought that I was really struck by the answer because, as you know, Arthur was known for being almost stoic on the court. He contained his emotions. He didn't
Sure.
let you know how he was feeling. And then even in press conferences, he was very measured and understated, and you didn't see him express his emotions that much. So when he told me that, I realized how much it had hurt him as well. And in a way, I felt kind of vindicated by what had happened to me months earlier, because you could see that you could feel the pain as he talked about it.
Well, Steve, we're nearing the end of our time, even though I have easily, tons of questions for you. So I'll kind of segue just real quick to, it is said often that tennis doesn't change that much in terms of rules, in terms of format, but we are seeing things change, such as on-court coaching, electronic line calling. There was a video review the other day that was significant in a match. I'm curious about your thoughts on some of these changes, the loss of the lines people, et cetera. What is your take on this as someone
You
who's
know,
been around the game for a few days?
it's funny. You might think you might be surprised by my answer. A lot of people in my position who saw the game decade, who've been watching it for 5 decades or more, and you can get nostalgic and say, "Oh my God, look at the incident! Look at the value, the human element of having linesmen out there and altercations and disputes." And I could tell you 1,000 stories of things that I did see that were fascinating along those lines. But I'm actually very happy. To me, the first primary goal has to be the best possible officiating and the best possible calls for the players. So to me, having electronic lines is great. It's even better than challenges, because challenges force the players to be selective about they had to be very selective in the challenges, and they might miss out. It's asking a player to react instantaneously, and it's not always that easy when you're in motion like that. Now they don't have to worry. So I think we've gone from one good step was the challenges to electronic lines, which is even better. And then again, the dispute you mentioned, it was in an Alcaraz match, and it was Alcaraz against Jack Draper in the semis of Indian Wells, and they're 1-1 in the third, and it's a big point because it ends up putting Carlos down 15-30, but Draper retrieved a drop shot and got it back and had the point won, but the umpire thought he'd gotten it on 2 bounces, so they review that first and determined that he did get it on 1 bounce, and then Draper makes a second challenge in a way by saying, "But I don't think we should play the point over." And then he talked to Carlos, and then the umpire reviewed it again, and then the umpire decided, yes, it's your point, 15-30. And he ends up breaking Carlos, and then he ended up going on to win that match. But I like these changes. I understand we're still always going to have an umpire. We're not going to miss that. The umpire is going to take charge. He doesn't have as much to do. He doesn't have to worry about overrules. I get it. But there still will be disputes. There still will be controversial moments. But the bottom line to me is get the calls right. The players deserve that much. The game becomes more and more professional. So I'm all for it.
Well, Steve, again, I have a lot more questions for you, but we are out of time. You have to promise, first of all, let me ask you some more questions down the road. Is that okay?
Of course. Of course. Be
Thank
happy
you.
to come back.
Well, I have enjoyed this. I want to thank you on behalf of me, tennis fans around the world, the millions that will view and listen to the show, Florida Tennis, on behalf of the Bleacher Brothers Sports Network, Steve Flink, Hall of Famer. It has just been an amazing time for me, and I hope you've enjoyed your time. And thank you so very, very much for your time, Steve.
Well, thanks for having me on, Adam. I enjoyed it immensely, as I always do when we talk tennis.
Thank you.